Hey guys, we are looking at a map of central Japan, and as you can see there's a route between Kyoto and Tokyo, and parts of that route have been used for up to 1300 years, and more consistently during the Edo period this particular route was used as the main route between Kyoto and Tokyo. There was another route that ran closer to Nagoya and closer to the coast, but this was the main inland route between Kyoto and Tokyo. And it was made up of 69 post stations, and today we're going to be visiting number 42, which is Tsumago, which is in the mountains between Gifu and Nagano. So we're looking at some very old maps of the Nakasendo here. Obviously, over the years, because often these routes are the best way to get between different towns and between different parts of Japan, over the years obviously new highways have been built and new towns have been built, so quite often the original paths and the original towns have been totally covered up with big 4-lane highways and big cities and that sort of thing. But fortunately some of these more isolated parts of the route, they're actually up in the mountains in small valleys and small places where highways bypassed. Some of these places are still standing. So here we are, number 42, station number 42 of the 69 stations is Tsumago. And it was fairly well preserved just by the nature of its position, of its location up here, isolated up in a small little valley. Over the years, as they've made a lot of the big highways, they've put tunnels through mountains and they've put big overpasses over valleys and things. So a lot of these small towns have fortunately been bypassed, and so quite often have sort of survived in their original condition. So apparently back in the 60s, so about 50 years ago, the people of this area realised what important asset this place was, so they restored and repaired some of these beautiful old buildings. But we actually saw a lot of before and after shots. There was a little museum in this place and there was a lot of before and after shots, and it was quite interesting to see that quite often there was very little done. They'd have the photo of these old houses before they were restored and then the photo after they were restored, and quite often there was very little done at all. Usually more preservation work than restoration. So in other words, just putting up some protective tiles or protective wood in areas where mud had been exposed on the walls or things like that, just to keep the buildings from deteriorating further. But they're all very original, very beautiful. And the actual scenery itself is incredible because it's actually between the mountains and a beautiful valley, fresh water running all the way through the town. Just wonderful. Really quiet too, of course. This road's closed for through traffic, so very peaceful, just the sound of the birds and the running water. See the wooden gutterings on the roof up there, wooden gutterings with pegs, no nails, just wood, made of wood with little pegs holding it together. There's another one the same, roof guttering up there made of wood. So this one's an old inn. So obviously these 69 stations, it was 500 kilometers or something from Kyoto to Tokyo via this route. So obviously people were needing to stay because they were walking. The only way to get around was walking, or small horses. They had small horses as well, or some very fortunate people were carried by other people. We'll get to that a bit later. But obviously there was a lot of physical exertion required, and particularly up in the mountainous parts up here. So obviously they needed these places to stay in. So we're looking at an old inn here. There are fire pits there on the floor that we've actually showed you before, those roidi. And obviously they'd be very pleased to get to these places, particularly in winter. Up here in the mountains it's very, very cold. Conditions are pretty harsh up in the mountains. So once they got to these little towns, they'd be very pleased to be getting inside next to the fire in the little inn there, eating some fish and some daikon vegetables and enjoying the ryokan. So this street was just full of izakaya, so little inns, little food inns and ryokan to stay in, and storehouses. So you guys know we have a thing about the storehouses, these kura Whenever we find a nice example of a kura, we show you. And interestingly, we've noticed this before, in the mountains, kura do seem to be more prevalent. It's possibly because the winters are so harsh, they need to store more things. So we see a lot of kura up in the mountains, a lot of storehouses up in the mountains, and this town's full of them, so it's a good example of that too. So a lot of these businesses are still operating. The little izakaya, little restaurants are still operating. The little ryokan, there's a couple of ryokan in the town that are still operating, and quite often by descendants of the original owners, which is quite incredible. Lovely old shrine. One of the best houses in the town that we're going to show you shortly is actually over 500 years old, and it was actually renovated 140 years ago. But it's been in the same family for over 500 years, and the family who own it now, their ancestors 500 years ago actually had the Tsumago Castle, and were sort of like the local lords of the area, and the same family still own the house now, which is quite incredible, isn't it? And that's quite not unusual in Japan for people to own houses that have been in the family for longer than they know. See this is another little inn. See the little fire pit there? So that wooden floor would have had tatami on it. You'd sit on the tatami around the fire there. And no chimney, as you can see. The idea is that the smoke goes up into the roof, and the smoke actually helps preserve, because it helps keeps insects out of the wood and out of the thatching and out of the roofs. Also makes a really nice smell. You go into those old places, there's always a beautiful old smoky smell to them. So this particular part of the path was actually quite narrow, and they did it on purpose for defence, apparently. Quite beautiful, isn't it? So this is actually the original post office. So this is the one. This is what was the most important thing here 200-300 years ago. And it still is the post office. And the reason we haven't showed you inside is because inside's actually a normal modern post office, still operating. So obviously, originally the postal route was an important part of this route, was to move the post and parcels and things from one city to the other, from Kyoto to Tokyo via this route. So those postal stations are really important. Here's another kura. Here's another storehouse. It was like Christmas, it was for us, with all these storehouses going on. Just beautiful. So this place, the business of this place was to rent labour and horses. So obviously people moving through the mountains would need help to move their goods. So you could rent horses and people from this company to help you move your things through the mountains. And this, right outside this little shop, was sort of like the central part of town, and it's where people would gather and get ready to move on and that sort of thing. So it was like the central part of it. Just imagine it, can't you? All the people standing around here with their little horses and their backpacks and their big hats on. Another kura, another storehouse. Beautiful, isn't it? This is the old house we're talking about. This one's history goes back 500 years. Now the end of the Edo period, beginning of the Meiji period, until then there'd been a ban on what sort of wood could be used to build houses, and the very special woods were not allowed to be used to build houses. They're only allowed to be used by noble people, and then they lifted that ban at the beginning of the Meiji era. So these guys, who are very important people in the town, this is the family that used to be the local lords and that actually controlled the local castle. So once the ban was lifted, these guys rebuilt this house using special cypresses and nice timbers. So it's now 150 years old. So the history of the house is 500 years old. Parts of it are 500 years old. But the main beams and things have been replaced, and so it's 150 years old. So this was the, what do they call it, the Honten. This is where the main inn, where dignitaries, when dignitaries passed along this route to travel between Tokyo and Kyoto, the dignitaries would stay at in this big old house. So there was always one special place in each town where the dignitaries would stay. And interesting, that main area downstairs, and then there's this second area upstairs, which is sort of a sleeping area and that sort of thing on the second floor. And then on the third floor, they actually had a room, and they told us it was for secret talks. So if the dignitaries were staying in this place and they needed to talk about important things, they'd go up to the third floor and sit in the little room up there, so they could talk about sort of secret things or important things without anybody overhearing them. So these doors, they think these sliding doors here actually came off the castle. So the castle was 500 years old. It's gone. The castle's gone. It didn't survive. But they say these sliding doors came off the castle, which would make them 500 years old, which is nice, isn't it? So that little secret room we were talking about up here looks like a closet, doesn't it? And they'd go up the stairs here, a bit hard to see in the dark, but there you get it, up there, and sit in that room up there, and they'd talk about their important things that they didn't want to be overheard. These are just the sleeping rooms for the visitors, for the guests. So same house, this is outside the back of the same house, and of course it has a big cooler of its own there, big storehouse of its own. So you can just imagine in winter, when the place is covered in 3 meters of snow, all their food and all their important things have to be kept in the storehouse, don't they? So we got here, this is December, end of December, so we got here just before the snows, but come back here in a couple of weeks and this place will be probably covered in a couple of meters of snow, most likely. Now, some of you guys might have seen this before. See these two guys here carrying this little thing. You could consider this to be Japan's first taxi system, right? So there was actually people used to ride in that little box, and two guys would carry it. So we referred to this before about some lucky people getting carried through the mountains. Well, this is what we meant. So you've got the pole over the top, one guy at each end, and one lucky person sitting inside the little box there. And it is a little box. And you can see not much in there, just a armrest either side and a cushiony bit at the back to lean against and a cushion to sit on, and off you go. So pretty hard work for the guys carrying it. And not a real big box. That's an interesting thing that we notice here too. If you look at the old samurai armor, you'll often find it's very small. So obviously, as with people around the world, over the years people have got bigger. So when we go back in history, we find people were smaller. European armour's the same too. When you see European armour, it's often quite small, isn't it? So we've got bigger over the years. So two small guys were carrying another small person in that box. Would have been hard work up the mountain tracks. Harnessing a bit of water power there. Well, this is the notice board, 500-year-old notice board, so any important notices for the people travelling through the town, this is where they'd be put. So we were joking it's a 500-year-old Facebook page. That's what Facebook looked like 500 years ago. So another famous family from the town owned this house. And again, there's the fire pit, there's the royalty there in the middle of the floor. Have a look at this. See that chest of drawers over there, guys? You might remember we showed you one like that once before. We have one of those at our farmhouse. Except ours is a little bit better condition. That one's actually fairly rustic. Ours is actually pretty shiny, but always interesting to see things that you own in a sort of a place like this, sort of a museum type environment. So this little path over here goes across. There's an old building, but there's also an empty space where the customs building used to be, or the inspection station they called it. So when people were passing through town, they'd come past this spot first, and there was an inspection station here where officials would inspect their travel documents and their goods, probably make sure everything was as it should be. So you can just imagine, can't you, when you look at these scenes here, you can just imagine there's been history going past here, you know, down these very paths that we're walking on for 500 years. Or 1300 years. Some parts of the path have been used for 1300 years, which is incredible, isn't it? And probably before that, we went to a museum here where they had little arrowheads and things going back thousands of years. So obviously people have been living here for a long time. So there's all sorts of history going on all around you here. Beautiful place. This temple was 15th century. And one of the oldest buildings in the town. Often the case too, because temples are so well looked after, and they're so well built quite often, and then so well maintained and looked after, and the whole town puts time and effort and money into maintaining the temples. So quite often they're the best preserved building in the town. Beautifully built and well maintained. So 500-year-old room here in the temple. And the priest's still there, gets handed down through the generations, the guardianship of these temples, and the priest was still there. He came in and talked to us, and he was telling us this is the oldest hand-pulled cart in Japan. So obviously the difference between this and the one we're looking at before is this one actually has wheels, whereas the one we're looking at before doesn't. But the oldest hand-pulled cart in Japan. You can see the wheels over there on the wall. We were trying to work out why it had two sets. One was sort of more decorative, whether it's just straight up for decorative purposes or for whatever reason. But isn't that an amazing piece of living history right there? So of course one of the things that brought the Nakasendo to the end was the advent of trains in Japan. So once they started putting train lines around the country, obviously that was a much better way to get around than walking, carrying all your stuff. So it sort of brought about the end of the Nakasendo really as a one piece thing. And it's only because we've been lucky that some of these little towns like this one are sort of so isolated that there's parts of it still around for us to see. But if you get to Japan at any time and you have the opportunity to see parts of the Nakasendo, then we highly recommend it to you, because it really is an amazing experience to walk along these paths that have been walked along by so many people over the years. It's quite an amazing experience. Anyway, hopefully somebody enjoyed that. More videos coming soon.